And we have with us here today a guest that I'm really excited about. Colin Grabow is the Associate Director. Correct me if I get this wrong, Colin. We just practiced this beforehand. Associate Director at the Cato Institute Center for Trade Policy Studies. Did I get that right?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. And sort of our paths crossed with Colin recently. We had published a piece on the Jones Act, which is what we're going to talk about today. And Colin is sort of the resident expert, laser focused, has been laser focused on this policy issue for a few years now. And so we're going to get an education today about what is the Jones Act, this obscure act that probably most Americans don't know anything about, but it impacts our day-to-day lives in potentially pretty significant ways. So Colin, unless there's anything you want to say before we start, we can kind of jump into our conversation.
Yeah, let's get into it.
All right, so maybe you could start us off. Why don't you just explain, what is the Jones Act, and then we can get into a little bit of the history, which I think is interesting. We had recently discussed something about the history that you kind of opened my eyes to some aspects of it. But let's talk about the act first. What is it, and why should we care? Yeah.
Yeah. So the Jones Act is the colloquial name for Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And essentially just says that if you want to transport goods by water within the United States, you have to use a vessel that meets four conditions. It has to be flagged and registered in the United States. It has to be built in the United States. It has to be at least 75% owned by American citizens, and it has to be crewed by American citizens. So why is this important? Well, the Jones Act affects transportation, and transportation is a pretty big deal in a country the size of the United States. I mean, I think it's important in any circumstances, but especially in a country this just geographically expansive. The cost of transportation can be a barrier to trade. So opportunities to make transportation more efficient, I think, are very important and very significant for this country.
Great. So this law is 100 years old, and maybe we can talk a little bit about how it came about before we get into its implications in our life today. If you want, we could play a little game here because I was sort of studying this subject, a few months ago, and there's sort of a conventional narrative that's out there about why the Jones Act exists, and but then there are other aspects to it that often don't get highlighted as much, and maybe I could sort of try to explain what I think is the conventional narrative. You tell me if I've gotten it totally off, and like what are some elements of that story that you think are critical that are missing? Is that fair?
Sounds good.
So from my reading, what I understood is that, in World War One, most of the imports and exports coming into the US were, a lot of them were carried on foreign ships. And when World War One kicks off, uh, a lot of those ships get diverted back to Europe, Germany, wherever they're from, to support their war efforts, and that creates sort of an inflation crisis here, or prices sort of spike here because whatever goods aren't being shipped properly. And then also when the U.S. gets involved in World War One, there's this people look around and they realize, wait a second, we don't have the necessary capacity to like ship our troops into the battlefield. And so from what I read, America goes into this emergency build out phase where like the amount of what they call gross tonnage, which I think is just the amount of capacity our ships can handle, we just build it out enormously. We confiscate whatever foreign ships are still confiscate. I think there's a different word that they use, but they basically take control of some of those. And we build out this capacity, and we try to we send our troops over there. We still have to rely on foreign ships to send our troops. We're not able to build out enough. And then afterwards, there's this post hoc analysis of like, okay, we built out all this extra gross tonnage. We don't want to be in this situation again where we just don't have enough ships to carry our troops, and we're at the mercy of these foreign ships. And so we need to absorb all these new ships we've built, and we want to make sure we have a strong merchant marine industry in the United States, forever, so that we're like resilient. So the merchant marine is not the Navy ships. It's like commercial ships, but which can be diverted to military use if needed, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we have, there's a Senator Wesley Jones who sort of sponsors, I think, a bill which is then sort of now known by his name. And I think I have a quote here where it's described as part of an earnest effort to lay the foundation of a policy that will build up and maintain an adequate American merchant marine in compliance with the shipping of the world. Okay. And this explains exactly like what you were laying out, where ships have to be built here, they have to be crewed by Americans, they have to fly the US flag, et cetera. And that'll protect the industry. It'll make sure these ships always have customers who are demanding their services, and it'll keep our shipbuilding resilient. And that will be great for our national security. Is that roughly a fair kind of historical narrative?
So I think you get a lot of points right.
Yes.
It's certainly true that during World War One, the U.S. was highly reliant on foreign shipping for international trade. For
Yeah.
example, if you want to export cotton to Europe,
Yeah.
you're probably using a foreign ship because they're a lot more competitive than the prices offered by U.S. shipping. So World
Right.
War One comes along. These countries whose ships were flying their flags. They requisition these ships for wartime use. They need, the ships can't be carrying consumer goods. They need them to carry, munitions and other items to support the war effort.
Yeah.
So that leaves U.S. Exporters in a pickle. I mean, freight rates skyrocket, and it takes a little bit for that to get resolved. Then obviously the U.S. in 1917 it enters the war itself and also needs ships to transport supplies as well as the men. I mean, this is pre-commercial, airliners. So all the soldiers had to travel by ship too, and we don't have enough shipping. This leads to a crash shipbuilding program. They had to build, we didn't have enough shipyards. We didn't have enough ships. We had to build new shipyards from scratch. Something I think over 2,000 ships were built during this effort, but unfortunately, most of them were delivered after the war was already over.
Oh, really?
And this,
Okay.
then of
Yeah.
course, then the war does end. We have the armistice in November 1918. What are we going to do with all these ships that have been delivered and that are still on the way? The government is not normally in the business of owning lots of commercial ships. What are they going to do with it? And that was the impetus for the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which was how to dispose of these ships, get them back into private hands. What's the best way of going about that? And what's the best way of going about that in a way that will ensure the U.S. has a strong merchant marine for years to come? Now, as I mentioned earlier, Section 27, which is what today we refer to as the Jones Act. So back in 1920, the term Jones Act referred to the entire act. But today it's typically used to refer just to that section that applies to what's called coastwise trade. So this is trade, this is shipping within the United States. This is not international. And, one of the components, again, is the U.S. build requirement. The vessels have to be built here. But these kind of requirements go back to the country's founding. None of that was new. The Jones Act, Section 27, is properly understood as a tweak. There were some small adjustments to it, but its overall concept wasn't anything dramatically new and different. But then this, of course, leads to an obvious question. So, yeah, if the Jones Act, we already had, these kind of provisions in place, what was the point of the Jones Act? Why was Section 27 included?
Right.
And I'll try to make this as quick as I can. Basically, when you go back to the country's founding, it's a much different environment in the sense that today and even back in 1920, U.S. shipping was not competitive. That's why we were using foreign shipping when the war broke out. But back at the country's founding, it was actually very competitive. This is the days of wooden ships with, powered by sails, wind power, and they're built of wood. The United States, the 13 original colonies, 13 original states, lots of wood, big forests here. So lots of raw materials to work with. The 13 states were all along the water. We had lots of immigrants from countries that knew about shipbuilding. A lot of people grew up along the water. They knew about shipbuilding. So, in fact, back when we were part of the British Empire, the colonies supplied something like, I want to say, a third of all, British flag ships were built here in the U.S., which also makes sense because Europe was kind of deforested. They ran out of only so many trees you can chop down.
Right. Right.
So the point being, American shipping was very competitive. So we had provisions instead of banning foreign shipping. Originally, the U.S. said, "Okay, you can use foreign ships to transport goods within the country, but you're going to have to pay high tariffs on that." And basically, while it didn't outright prohibit foreign shipping on a de facto basis, there was really no reason to use foreign shipping because A, American shipping was so competitive, and B, the tariffs are so high on using foreign ships. So not a big imposition. But as time goes on, that changes, and we move to ships powered by steam and built out of iron, and the American shipbuilding industry falls behind. And by the time we get to about roughly the 1860s, U.S. built ships are significantly more costly than those built abroad. Anywhere from you see numbers from like 20 to 50% more expensive, and people start looking for ways around these laws. How do I avoid this requirement that I use an American ship? So in the late 1800s, we get this case called the 250 kegs of nails case, where somebody wanted to ship 250 kegs of nails from, I believe, New York to California, and they did it by going through Belgium. They sent a foreign ship with the kegs to Belgium, and then load onto another foreign ship, and went from Belgium to California. And they had done the math and figured that actually this made more sense than just using an American ship to go more
Wow.
directly.
Yeah.
So there's a court case over this. The court rules and says, yeah, actually that's permissible. The way the law is written, you can do that. So Congress changed the law and says, no, no, no. If you start and finish in the U.S., you have to use an American ship. But there's still another loophole out there, and it's basically has to do with Alaska. If you sent the attorney general ruled that, okay, like what's a voyage? And he kind of said, well, if it goes by land to a foreign port and then goes to an American port with a foreign ship, it's okay. So people were sending goods up to and from Alaska, going through Canada, through British Columbia, go over, rail or whatever up there, and then get transferred to a foreign ship from Canada to Alaska. So who hated this? Well, Seattle-based shipping companies. They thought, no, 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 this is a loophole. This is an evasion of our laws. All that business belongs to us. They should be using our ships. This is unfair competition. So then along comes the Merchant Marine Act in 1920. And during the hearings for this act, there was a guy named William Clark who represented the Pacific Steamship Company based out of Alaska. And he said, look, yeah, we've got this issue. We need to change the law to tweak the language so that, basically, even if you go over land, you still have to use an American ship. You can't use this workaround. And he said, in fact, I brought with me an amendment, the exact language I think we should adopt. And if
Yeah.
you look at the language that he proposed and what got adopted, it's like 90% the same. And
Right.
so that is how we came to have Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which we call the Jones Act today.
Right. Okay. So what you're saying is like the correct way to understand the Jones Act is it's just the most recent major amendment to a sort of protectionist stance that's been there since the founding, basically.
Yeah, I think it's a great
Uh,
move. It's the latest
yeah.
iteration of these
Yeah.
kinds of laws. Yes.
Right. Okay. Um, so let's double click and I love these stories of just like I mean vested interest, like the ground reality of how these things happen is always like very fascinating, because there's always this narrative and then there's like what's actually happening on the ground, right? So um let's talk a little bit about what is the impact of this law been, and in multiple different ways. One is like, okay, at least the claim was that if we protect U.S. shipbuilding and U.S. shippers and sailors, etc., that'll at least keep, like, okay, that'll keep that industry alive. It'll keep our shipbuilders strong. It'll keep our ships in use. It'll make sure we have like a well-trained merchant marine crew at all times. Um, and some may argue, okay, if you have to pay a little bit of extra cost for that, maybe that's good for national security purposes. Some may argue that. So, like, let's talk a little bit about like how has the law stood up relative to its own kind of mandate and justification, and then also what are the knock-on effects of that. So maybe you can take that first part first. Yeah.
Yeah, so like you said, I think the theory behind the Jones Act is, this isn't just some, crony capitalist giveaway. There's actually a logic to this.
Right.
We require that the vessels be built in the United States, which means we have to have shipyards to build them. And in time of war, it's good to have shipyards because they can build more ships or repair existing ships. That's a useful thing to have. By reserving domestic trade to American ships, it means that we will have American ships. In time of war, you can grab those ships and they can be repurposed to carry material and supplies for the military. It means that you have to use American sailors. So in time of war, you don't have to use foreigners. There's theoretically, a ready reserve of mariners that can crew American ships, which has obvious utility. So that's the theory behind the law. I think the problem is that the law doesn't do a good job of meeting those goals. So if you look at shipbuilding, for example, so if you go to the Shipbuilders Council of America's website, they have a section on the Jones Act. It says the Jones Act ensures a robust and competitive shipbuilding industry. Well, the problem is U.S. shipbuilding industry is anything but robust and certainly not competitive. Last year there was just one large ocean-going cargo ship delivered from a U.S. shipyard. The year before that there was one. I think the year before that there were zero. The year before that there was one. Next year this year there's slated to be zero. Next year there's going to be like one ship built that is designed to install rocks for offshore wind farms. The next container ships aren't scheduled to be delivered till 2026, one, and then two in 2027. I mean, just for frame of reference, I think last year, the year before, Hyundai by itself, one of its shipyards was in South Korea, is supposed to deliver 47 ships, that year.
Wow.
And the country is into the hundreds of ships per year, and we're talking one or two. Now, in fairness, I'm not talking about ferries, tugboats, offshore service vessels, things, smaller craft of that nature. I'm just talking about large ocean-going ships. And yes, we do build some tugboats and things like that. So it's not zero. But to put this on a global perspective, the United Nations they have data on global shipbuilding production, and in 2022, which is the most recent data, the U.S. accounted for 0.13% of gross of tonnage delivered that year. And the year before, it was 0.05%. The year before that, it was 0.12%. I think in the last 10 years, our high water mark has been like 0.53%. So it's consistently a fraction of 1% of what's going on in the world. So I think on the shipbuilding angle, it's really hard to make the case that it's really providing a robust set of shipyards that we can use in time of war. In terms of shipping, the ships themselves, so the Jones Act fleet right now, in terms of these large ocean-going ships, again, setting aside, barges and tugboats and things like that, it consists of 92 large ocean-going ships, of which I think something like 74 are classified as militarily useful. That's not a lot. And
what is
then in
like
terms
how
of
many
how many
ships are in the
how many
world?
ships are there out in the world? So
Yeah.
I believe there are something like 54,000 ships of 1,000 gross tons or more out there. Now, how many of those are large cargo ships? I'm not sure, but it's definitely over 10,000. It's over 10,000. It's so we're just a tiny fraction of the
Right.
global population of these large cargo ships.
So the
And
US
go
is
ahead.
not, so the US is not currently, a major player in the global shipbuilding industry. That's just the nature of
No, not at
in
all. In
terms of
fact,
like
go
large
ahead.
seafaring vessels, which was kind of the idea of why this law was put. Like we want to have those kind of ships if we need it in crisis situations.
Yeah, I don't think you can make the case that Jones Act is all about producing tugboats, that, that's going to be what saves our day militarily. And yes, and we're certainly not internationally competitive. Right now, a US built tanker is estimated to cost about 4 times more than one built abroad. So that's
Yeah.
roughly, 50 million versus 200 million.
Okay.
Container ships are 4.5 to 5 times more expensive. We haven't exported a ship to another country since I believe 1960. So yeah, no, the U.S. is not competitive with basically anybody when it comes to shipbuilding.
Right. Okay. And you brought up a really interesting point, and this is something, that gets quoted a lot in this discourse is that, like you said, 200 million to build a container ship in the US, like a US shipyard. That exact same kind of ship you can buy from a foreign operator at like, 50 million, maybe something around that. So then that raises the price, obviously, of using ships, right? Which then reduces the demand for them. And now what can you go into a little bit of like what are the knock-on effects of that? Like since we're not producing a lot of ships, like how are we moving goods around in this $20 trillion economy of ours? And like basically what are the knock-on implications of this protectionist policy?
Yeah, so theoretically, we'd have a lot of ships and shipbuilding, but we've made it so incredibly expensive that no one wants to use it, or almost no one. Basically, we only use Jones Act shipping when we have no other alternative.
Okay.
So, the vast majority of those 92 ships I mentioned, they either do one of two things. They are transporting goods to the non-contiguous states and territories, so Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, or they're transporting refined products and oil, say from Alaska to the West Coast, or from Gulf Coast refineries to Florida and other places that aren't connected by pipelines. So that's where we use ships, where we have no alternative. We've taken what should be a very efficient means of transportation, and we kind of turned it into a last resort, which is really damning, I think. Because again, the ships are 4 to 5 times more expensive to build, and then they're 3 times more expensive to operate than internationally flagged ships. So Americans use other forms of transportation. Thankfully, most of us, we don't live in the non-contiguous states and territories. We have other options. We can use pipelines, we can use rail, we can use trucking, and we do. Um, so despite having, thousands of miles of coastline and home to some of our major cities, ships account for only 2% of freight moved in the United States. If you add
Yeah.
in barges, which you find on, say, the Mississippi River, and our Great Lakes and stuff, that's another 4%. And if you add in mixed modes, so say water plus rail or water plus trucking, I think you get up to a total of 9%. So that is shipping plus barges plus mixed modes. We're at 9%. And that's kind of crazy when you stop and think about the geography of the United States. I mean, not only do we have places you can only, get to by water or air, like, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, et cetera. But then we have thousands of miles of coastline. We have these big rivers. We have the Great Lakes. We have a geography that kind of lends itself in many ways to waterborne transportation, and we've kind of turned away from that. So I have to think there's a real opportunity cost. So a lot of people may be listening to this and thinking, well, that sounds like a Hawaii problem. That's not, how does this really affect me? And I think you have to try to conceive and think about, what does the United States look like without the Jones Act versus what it looks like today? And what if we made greater use of our coasts, for shipping? And think about all the supply chains that could develop. And because right now, I mentioned that one way of avoiding the Jones Act is use a truck or whatever. But another way is you just buy stuff from abroad, from overseas. A classic case of this is oil. United States, we're one of the world's biggest oil producers. We export a decent amount. but East Coast refineries buy most of their oil not from Texas. They buy it from the Middle East, from Africa, because when you factor in the cost of transportation, it doesn't make sense to buy American. You can think of other examples. Um, I found a report, a U.S. government report from I think the late 80s, early 90s, and it was about the steel industry. And it mentioned that one reason that the western part of the United States was buying a lot of imported steel instead of buying steel from East Coast producers is because, again, the cost of transportation. And it specifically cited the Jones Act.
Yeah.
So say if we don't have Jones Act, people would be buying more American steel. We've had timber producers complain and say, look, we want to export our timber from the Northwest United States to other parts, and we're getting beat out by Canadians because Canadians, they can use international shipping. But if we want to ship it, we have to use Jones Act shipping. That puts us at a competitive disadvantage. So you think about all the ways our economy has been oriented away from domestic supply chains because of the Jones Act and all the opportunities, potential opportunities on the table that we could take advantage of if we had access to more efficient shipping, which would better enable Americans to buy and trade with each other. And then kind of lastly, so these are, I'll give you the most extreme kind of example of what the Jones Act does. I gave examples of where it's, you can buy the American product, but it just doesn't make sense. But there are other examples where you cannot buy American products. So Puerto Rico uses natural gas for roughly like 40% of its electricity generation. And almost all of it is imported from foreign countries, even though we are the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. So why is that? Last year, Puerto Rico bought, I think the number one source of LNG was Nigeria. Meanwhile, there's an LNG export terminal near Savannah, Georgia, just like a 3-day sail away.
Yeah.
Why are they doing this? It's because there are no LNG tankers that comply with the Jones Act.
Oh, okay.
So they have no choice. They cannot access American products because there are no vessels capable of transporting it. And some people might be listening to this and thinking, well, this sounds like an easy problem to solve. Just build the ship and then people can use it. Well, yeah, theoretically, but according to the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, building that kind of ship overseas is $180 million, where the estimated US cost is $700 million. Like the math
Wow.
makes no sense whatsoever. No one's going to build that ship.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are just some of like the ludicrous kind of ridiculous outcomes. And I think they're symptomatic of some of the broader dysfunction you see out there because of this law.
Yeah, it's more of that sort of Belgian nail example, like in that kind of thing where it's like a kind of ridiculous detour needs to be taken, and in some cases things are just priced out of the market entirely, and they're just impossible to transport because it's like correct me if I'm wrong, water-based transport is the data on this may vary, but it's significantly cheaper than transporting by land, by road or rail. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it depends a lot on the distances you're talking about.
Yeah.
So the longer the distance, the more competitive water becomes.
Yeah.
Shorter distances, like you're not going to ship something from like Boston to Providence with a container ship, just because
Sure.
the
Sure.
port costs involved and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
certainly, yeah, the long there's there's certain points, like for example, just as there's certain points at which jet travel is much more attractive than rail. Like if I want to go from here to DC up to New York, rail is a pretty good option. Drops me off right in the middle of Manhattan, pretty nice. But I wouldn't take rail to Los Angeles. It makes no sense whatsoever. So it's kind of
I don't
similar
know, man. Those
with
those
that.
Amtrak tickets are a little a little expensive sometimes,
Yeah,
but
they're not cheap. I mean, that's a
that's a
whole
different
nother
story. That's a
conversation.
different
What
story.
we've taken what should be again another what should be an efficient means of transportation and made it
Yeah.
kind of ridiculous.
Seem to be good at that, huh?
But
Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, there's a reason why something like depends on the numbers you look at. Like 80% of international trade takes place with ships. I mean, part of it's because
Right.
obviously the world is 70% covered by water, but
Sure.
also it's a pretty efficient means of moving goods.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one that unfortunately again we've kind of priced ourselves out of.
Yes, it's like water has a natural place in the logistics system of a country, and I guess what you're saying is that because of regulation and protectionist policy, like water is not able to take its natural place in our economic system, basically. And
Yeah, I think that's right.
all kinds of weird, ridiculous detours and what we could have sold from Texas to the Northeast. Instead, Texas is not able to sell to the Northeast. Instead, some foreign competitor to our own, potentially our own, companies is getting that business. Um, and if you think about it, like the environmental impact of this is probably also significant because you just have to use more energy than you would have otherwise have to use to move things around. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's true. So the environmental cost is that yes, there's more energy, and something I haven't even mentioned here is that by requiring Americans to or by requiring vessels having to be built in the U.S. and they're so expensive, well, that means that old ships get used for a lot longer than in other countries. So internationally, ships are typically scrapped anywhere from like 20 to 25 years of age. But
Yeah.
because they're so expensive, I mean, Jones Act ships are typically not scrapped till after age 40. So you
Mm,
have older ships that are less efficient out there, for a longer time. They're use more fuel and whatnot. But then also you're pushing more goods to other more polluting modes like trucking.
mm,
Shipping it's better than rail. It's not dramatically better, but it is better from a CO2 perspective, but it's absolutely better than trucking by
yeah.
quite a wide margin. And then there is just no comparison with airplanes, by far the most
Right.
CO2
Right.
emitting mode. So yeah, there's a real opportunity, to have a so the things that do already go by water, it could be made more efficient because we'd have, more modern vessels out there with the newest engines and whatnot. The most advanced, hull designs that can push through water most efficiently. And then also there's an opportunity just to switch modes to take stuff off of trucks and put it onto water. We can debate the scale of that happening, but I don't think it would be zero. I do think absolutely we'd have more stuff going by water. And then also furthermore consider that something goes by truck. Well, highways, a lot of them either go through or very close to major population centers.
Yeah.
Whereas ships are off on the coast, they're just physically further away from people. So that
Right.
also, seems desirable. So there's
Yeah.
absolutely, an environmental component to these costs as well. And then lastly, one other component that I think is often overlooked is that the Jones Act is a trade barrier. So when the United States negotiates trade agreements with other countries, when we frequently say, "Oh, please open your market to blah blah," because we'd like to sell you a lot of whatever American product, and then they say, "Oh, okay, well, how about you open your market so we can sell you some ships or shipping services?" And then we always say, "No, no, no, no way." So then they retaliate by keeping their market more closed to American exports. Just like
Okay.
here's a real life example of this
Wow.
is when the United States negotiated a free trade agreement with South Korea back in 2005 ish. We said, we'd like to sell you some rice. And the Koreans were like, well, we'd like to sell you some ships. And we said no. And they said no. And, so our farmers in that case, lose out. And, back after Brexit, the UK prime minister, he met with Trump and he said, yeah, we'd like to do an FTA, a free trade agreement with the US. And we'd like, cabotage shipping to be part of the discussions there. And,
Yeah.
again, obviously we didn't end up negotiating that, but that speaks to the desire by foreigners to try to provide these kind of services for us. And then, we don't, and they retaliate. And then other American industries lose out on export opportunities.
Wow. Yeah. See, you start pulling the thread on this, and there's like this one law that's on the books, and so basically to summarize or to try to summarize, this protectionist stance that the U.S. has in terms of its domestic shipping drives up the cost of domestically produced ships because partially there's no great incentive to remain competitive with the rest of the world. That's probably a big driver of that. And so these ships are so expensive, operating the ships is so expensive. So now shipping by water, which in the natural state of things is like cheaper than land, becomes prohibitively expensive. So now you have all this like cargo that's, moved onto roads, people in Hawaii and Alaska and Puerto Rico are probably you probably see it in the prices in those places where things may be even more expensive there than they are the similar products in the contiguous 48. Is that true? Does that happen?
That they're more expensive, yes. I mean,
Yeah.
someone has to pay the piper.
Yeah.
When you're subject to Jones Act, transportation, these are extra shipping costs. Those costs get passed
Right.
along. These companies don't just eat it and say, okay, that's fine. We're going to take less
Right.
profit.
No, there's no
Um,
charity. Yeah.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
exactly how that breaks down. So for example, what I've been told by people knowledgeable about such things is that so take Walmart. Well, Walmart has a store, at least one store, maybe more than one in San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Um, but the way that they pass along costs is they do costs on a regional basis. So they don't say, well, shipping to Puerto Rico is more expensive, so all those extra costs are going to be eaten by consumers in Puerto Rico. They spread those over costs within the southeast region that Walmart is part of. So in fact, Walmart's all over that region would pay extra costs because Walmart has to, someone
Oh,
has to, pay that extra.
wow.
Um, so somebody is paying extra, but it might not necessarily be just the people in Puerto Rico, although it stands to reason that they're
Yeah.
disproportionately going to pay more. But there's one thing you brought up about, yeah, U.S. shipbuilding being uncompetitive and basically being, they're hidden behind. They don't have to be the best, and they don't have to compete, so then they're not competitive.
That's
But I
that
think it's
that's the
worth,
impression that one gets.
yeah,
Like
that's the
as you
impression
listen.
one gets.
Yeah.
So, but it's worth asking the question, why are U.S. shipbuilders so uncompetitive? I mean, not just
Yeah.
a little bit uncompetitive. Why are they so dramatically uncompetitive? I mean,
Right.
why is it that American industries, and so many places we are fairly competitive? We have the world's second biggest automaker. Boeing, until a few years ago, was pretty competitive, building internationally rivaled Airbus. They used to be synonymous with quality. But why
Yeah.
why is shipbuilding so different? And I think I mean, it's not simple, but there's a couple elements that I think have a lot of explanatory power. And one is that shipbuilding is all about scale. It's all about because I think a lot of people just assume, well, that must mean that foreign shipbuilders is because they're paying their workers peanuts, and this just reflects that
Yes.
Americans, we have a higher standard of living or something along those
Health
lines.
insurance, benefit, all that
Yeah,
kind of, you just assume,
environmental regulations,
right,
things like
right.
that. But
Yeah.
no, I think that's very limited explanatory power.
Okay. Interesting.
Much more is scale. So, let's say I'm a shipyard in South Korea, and I'm getting again, I'm building 50 ships a year. So shipbuilding involves a lot of it's very capital intensive. You need a lot of technology. You need huge pieces of equipment like big gantry cranes, because the way ships are built is they're assembled in blocks, kind of like Legos. They take blocks. They, all right, let me pick up
We're
where I
back.
left off.
Yeah.
Ran raving about shipbuilding.
I know.
Um, yeah, so
You had to punch a
um,
wall, audience. You just had to punch the wall. So,
the
yeah.
way ships are built is they're built in blocks, and they kind of like Legos. They take blocks and set them into place, and you need huge cranes to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Among other pieces of equipment that you need. So if I'm building 50 ships a year, well, I'm spreading the cost of that crane over 50 ships. Whereas if I'm building one or two ships a year, I'm spreading those capital costs over fewer ships. There's other things like when I go to buy, ships need engines, they need steel to build them. Well, I go to my steel supplier, and what kind of price am I being quoted when I'm buying enough steel for two ships versus 50 ships or 50 engines and things like that. You get these volume discounts, and there's economies of scale that you realize that you just can't when you're operating at small scale. There's also just less specialization. So, for example, foreign yards, they'll get an order for like a dozen ships, 8 ships, 10 ships, whereas Americans
Mm.
build two. Well, when you build that first ship, there's a lot of stuff you learn that you can apply to the next ship. You go, oh, next time I know I'll do it this way, and that'll make it a little bit easier. And and less expensive, less costly. Well, in the Jones Act, I mean, with container ships, I mean, you never get orders for more than 2 ships. Tankers, I've never seen an order for more than 4 ships. So you just don't, you can't apply those lessons learned as much. And there's less specialization. You know, you look around the world and different countries and different shipyards tend to specialize and be really good at certain things. South Korea, for example, builds like 60-70% of all the world's LNG tankers. Finland is some of the best at building icebreakers. You know, the Dutch traditionally very good at building dredging vessels. The Western Europeans build like over 90% of the world's cruise ships, so on and so forth. Americans have no, specialty. So, you know, we're kind of a jack of trade, master of none. And what's wild is that, you know, I know I saw an article from like 2004, somewhere around there, saying the Dutch shipyards were building ships for 1/3 the US price while paying their workers like 20 to 40% more. And obviously also, you know, the Europeans, the Japanese, these are not, you know, regulatory free-for-alls where anything goes. They don't have environmental standards or health and safety or anything like that. So
Mm.
I think that then the last thing you hear as an explanation are subsidies. And it's often you'll hear that the reason Americans can't compete is because foreigners get these unfair subsidies and we don't, and that's why the price difference is what it is. I'm not going to say the explanatory power there is zero, but I think it's significantly overstated. There was a good paper done a few years ago looked at subsidies for Chinese shipyards. I think the Chinese are probably the most egregious practitioners of these subsidies. And it
Yeah.
basically concluded that these subsidies reduce their shipping costs from anywhere from 13 to 20%. Now, that's significant. But in the context of price differences of 300 to 400%, you know, that doesn't move the needle. I mean, you get rid of all subsidies, we're still in the exact same place that we
Yeah.
were beforehand. And
Yeah.
let's remember, I mean, the Jones Act is itself a subsidy to the U.S. shipbuilding industry. So
Yeah.
we don't have clean hands here.
Right. Right. Fair enough. It's interesting. So it's like there's just a lack of demand, which leads to an inability to specialize and get that kind
It's
of
a
scale.
vicious cycle because think
Yeah.
about it, you know, prices go up, so demand drops, so then you
Yeah.
further lose those economies of scale and specialization. So then it's a
Yeah.
cost quantity
Yeah.
trap that U.S. shipbuilders are caught in.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, it's like there's no demand because there's no demand. It's all it's almost like
Right.
that. That's what
Yeah.
it which is that's peculiar. I don't want to get lost in a rabbit hole of like the where did this vicious cycle start, because it's like somehow just that flywheel of demand never kicked off. Because when you sort of explain this, you're absolutely right, and I appreciate you sort of extrapolating on this nuance. People will just assume it's like, oh, the workers are too expensive, and that's where we get screwed, you know? But that's not the case. It's actually some deeper kind of there's just no interest in this service, or there's not much interest in the service, which means prices of accessing it or stay high, which means there's not interest in the service, you know?
Yeah,
Um,
one thing I'll just add is that it's not the case that, you know, these ships are so expensive and it just reflects that US shipyards are just taking massive profits. So,
yeah,
for example, back in 2018, 2019, I believe, the
yeah,
Philly shipyard delivered 2 ships for Matson, which serves Alaska, Hawaii, and Guam.
yeah,
And these ships, they cost $208 million a piece, which is at the time roughly, you know, again 4 or 5 times more than one built abroad. And Philly lost money on those ships. Um, and another factoid is that type of ship, that class, these are called the Aloha class ships. Well, in 2022, Matson ordered 3 more of those ships from Philly. The only difference is the new ones are going to be powered with LNG, and the new price is $333 million a piece. So they've gone from 209, and that contract was signed in like 2012, 2013, something like that. And in about a 10-year period, it's gone up by over $100 million.
mm.
So that's you know that's
Well,
where we're at.
inflation, you know? But Okay, that's interesting. Um, okay, that does lead me into sort of where I want to sort of round out the conversation, which is like, what do we do about this and how that's complicated by vested interests? But essentially, just the ground that we've covered, there's this protectionist stance that the U.S. has, raises the cost of building a ship here. Somehow, somewhere, like demand has just atrophied in this space, which keeps costs high. And a lot of our, which then trickles down to the rest of the economy because we started using trucks as opposed to ships. We started using more rail. We keep ships online longer just because again, there's just not much demand for a brand new ship at 300 million. So we'll just keep, extending the life of it even past its useful life, which I'm sure raises costs also in weird kind of ways. And so somehow we're just not allowing water to take its natural place in the logistics ecosystem in our economy. And this protectionist stance is sort of at the center of this issue. So what do we do about it? What do we how do we what are what is your ideal solution? And then practically speaking, what are some more what are solutions that you think actually may have a high probability of maybe passing Congress or actually getting implemented?
Yeah, so I become king. I usher in libertopia, libertarian principled society, blah blah. First order of business is we repeal the Jones Act. Now,
Yeah.
let me, give a nod to the national security angle. I do think that, the U.S. military needs ships to transport goods in time of war. We should
Yeah.
ensure that. We should ensure we have enough mariners
Yeah.
out there. How do we do that? So in my ideal world, we get rid of the Jones Act, and then when war breaks out, we use subsidized ships. So what do I mean by this? Well, right now we have something called the Maritime Security Program. This is a program that gives, I think, $5.3 million per ship to 60 different ships. And these are all foreign built ships and because they're foreign built, they can't operate inside the United States, even though they have an American flag and American crews. They're banned from transporting goods in the US. They operate purely in international trade, carrying imports and exports. We give those ships $5.3 million a year. And then in exchange for that, the US government has the right to grab those ships and use them to transport goods for the military in time of war or national emergency. To me, this makes sense. I think you can play with how it's administered. I think there should probably be a bidding system and not just a set, fee. But the general principle of I give you money and then you make your ship available if I need it, that seems sound to me. So I'm all for solutions like that. I'm like, let's just do things that work and stop doing things that don't work. And
Right.
by the way, I'll just note that in times of war, when we've actually had war break out, like the classic case being the Gulf War back in 1990, 91, when we had to get, troops and equipment and supplies over to Saudi Arabia as quickly as possible. I mean, there was one Jones Act ship that transported goods from the U.S. mainland to Saudi Arabia. And why? Well, it's because all the other Jones Act ships, they're taking stuff to Hawaii or Puerto Rico or wherever. And if you take that ship out of service, well, who's going to supply those places?
Yeah.
In reality, these ships don't even get used very much in terms
Right.
of war. But anyway, to my point, I would replace it with basically targeted subsidy programs to meet these needs. I go to the Pentagon and say, what do you guys need? How many ships do you need? Okay, you pay for it out of your budget and we're good. So that's how I do it. But is this going to happen anytime soon? Probably not. So what are other avenues? What are other policies that would alleviate the problems caused by the Jones Act that are perhaps more, let's not say, viable, but more viable? I think one would be instituting a waiver process based on commercial need. Right now, the only waivers you can get from the Jones Act is for reasons of national security. Basically, if the military says, look, I need to move this from here to there, I can't use a commercial ship, there's some kind of threat to national security that can only be addressed by using a foreign ship. then you can use one. But you can't just say, hey, I want to move this from here to there. This has nothing to do with the military, national security. It just, I want to sell it. I want to transport this, LNG to Puerto Rico, for example. You can't do it. So we need one for commercial reasons, basically saying, look, I'm willing to use a U.S. ship or Jones Act ship. None exist. So can I please use a foreign ship? Again, this isn't pie in the sky thinking. Mexico and Canada both have waiver systems like this. I think other countries do too. So this seems pretty commonsensical. Other things, I think that we should get rid of, at a minimum, the U.S. build requirement. If not for all vessels, then at least can we do it for large ocean-going ships, which we, again, are barely building any of. And furthermore, the few ships that we do build are filled with foreign components, and use foreign designs. So the idea that, well, okay, we pay more, but then we're not reliant on foreigners. I mean, that's a total illusion. These ships are absolutely dependent on foreigners for their construction. So let's just cut out the middleman and buy them direct from these foreign shipyards. I'm thinking here, if we can get ships for 1/4, 1/5 the cost, we probably have a larger fleet, a more modern fleet. It would employ more mariners. That would probably be good for our national security. So it'd be good for our economy. It'd be good for our national security as well. At a minimum, can we at least do it for, say, countries that we have mutual defense treaties with? Like our allies in Japan and South Korea and NATO. That just seems like incredibly sensible policy to me. I think that, Puerto Rico should be given an exemption from the Jones Act. Puerto Rico is a territory. It is the only U.S. territory that is fully subject to the Jones Act. U.S. Virgin Islands right next door is exempt. American Samoa is exempt. Guam is exempt from the U.S. build requirement. This is an island with a 40% poverty rate. Why are we subjecting them to some of the world's most expensive shipping? That just doesn't, and especially they have no, they can't vote for president. They have no, voice in the U.S. Senate. They have one non-voting member of the House. Just from a fairness perspective, that just seems wrong to me. So I think those are some good, starting points for reform of this law. And lastly, I'll just say, like with regard to the U.S. build requirement, if we got rid of that, all we'd be doing is bringing the Jones Act in line with all of our other cabotage laws. I mean, we have, restrictions on foreign airlines, and we have restrictions on foreign trucking. But you can still use a foreign built truck. You can still use a foreign built airline. Can we at least, forget what other countries are doing? Can we just bring some coherence to our own laws for transportation?
Makes sense. A couple of things. One is, and maybe I should have asked you to do this earlier, but we can do it now too. One is who benefits from the law as it stands? Like who is, are there any vested interests kind of things at play? And if you had to, how would you articulate sort of the strongest version of people who disagree with you, their arguments? How would you articulate that? You already walked through the sort of nuanced policy suggestions, which I'm assuming address some of those concerns, but just to have it clearly laid out, what is the steelman of the opposing side?
Okay, I'll lay out who those vested interests are, and then I'll give you the arguments that they I think would tell you if they were if they were in my shoes right now, doing this podcast. So the people that benefit are it's mainly threefold. It's three elements. It's the shipbuilders for quite obvious reasons. You have to buy what they make. They like that a lot. It's going to be the people that operate these Jones Act ships. They don't want foreign competition. They want to have these markets with high barriers to entry. If you look at the Hawaii market, the Alaska market, the Puerto Rico market, they're basically duopolies in all of them. So limited competition.
But they have to buy these $300 million ships, don't they?
They do, which they like. Because why would they like doing that? Well, because it's a barrier to entry. If someone says, "Hey, I'm going to go compete with you guys," and it's like, "Well, good luck. Go find that ship first. You're going to have to build it." And here's the other problem. Let's say it doesn't work out. Well, you can't just say, okay, so you take that $300 million ship, you can't just say, well, fine, I'm just going to sell it to someone else, because the only people that will probably buy it are on the international market, and they're going to give you a fraction of what you paid for it.
Right.
Um, like if you want to start up a new airline, well, you don't even have to buy an airplane. You can go lease some airplanes, that are already
Yeah.
out there and start something out. You can't do that in shipping. There are no, like used ships sitting around. Internationally, there are. You can charter ships, and people do that. But the Jones Act market, there are no ships just laying around waiting for someone to charter or lease or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a barrier to entry. And then whatever, yes, they have to pay a lot, but then they just pass those costs along. So,
Mm.
and again, these
Yeah.
are in place. They operate
Yeah.
in markets where you're not going to say, fine, I'm gonna go use a truck, I'm gonna go use a railroad, because those are
Right.
not options.
Captive. You're
Um,
captive. Yeah.
so yeah, so it's a really screwed up dynamic where ship operators like paying lots of money for for ships.
Got it. Got it.
Um,
Okay.
and then you have the people that crew the vessels.
Right.
And so when it comes to the ocean going fleet, these guys are highly unionized, and unions have a voice here in Washington. So those are kind of the three pillars of
Yeah.
for lack of a better term, the Jones Act lobby, people that advocate for maintaining this
Got it.
law. Now, and there's an umbrella group called the American Maritime Partnership that represents all three of these constituencies, but you can break it down even further. You have, as I mentioned before, the Shipbuilders Council of America that represents shipbuilders. You have all the various unions, the Master Mates and Pilots Union, the Seafarers International Union, the Marine Engineers Beneficial Association. These are all unions. And then you have people that represent different segments of the shipping industry. You have the Lake Carriers Association that represents folks that operate on the Great Lakes. You have the Offshore Marine Services Association that represents the industries focused on the Gulf of Mexico, vessels that serve oil platforms out there. You have the American Waterways Operators, which is focused on the tug and barge industry that operates on our rivers mostly. So yeah, and these people all advocate for the Jones Act and are here in DC making the case constantly. Now, if and they meet with congressmen regularly. Now, if you were to be a fly in the wall on one of those conversations where one of them is sitting down with a member of Congress saying, here's why we have the Jones Act, here's why we need to maintain it, I think it would go something like this. They would say, look, the Jones Act, this is not just protectionism. This is about the country's national security. The maritime industry plays a vital role in that. We have a history of making sacrifices for our country, most notably during World War II, when thousands of mariners lost their lives because they were sunk by German U-boats or Japanese submarines, some of them. And we carry, we support our military. And are you going to outsource this to foreigners? Are you going to trust foreigners to transport our goods, to build our ships? That's ultimately what's
Right.
driving this. I
Right.
think that's
They might put
you
cameras
go
in the
ahead.
hull somewhere and like map our internal, ports or something like that.
So I'm
That
giving
kind
I'm
that kind of
giving the
fear, right?
most
Yeah.
respectable arguments,
Yeah.
but you do hear
Yeah.
more imaginative ones like, yes, well, they say things like, well, then you'll have North Korean or Iranian or Chinese flagged ships in the Mississippi River, and they're sailing by critical military installations. They could spy. I've even heard the argument that this cracks down on illegal immigration, which I have no idea how that works because this is transportation within the United States.
All right.
Um,
Let's stick to the
Yeah.
like you were doing the
So,
respectable
but I
argument.
think the ones that know,
Yeah.
basically the national security thing. I think that I strongly suspect if someone was sitting in my shoes, that's more or less the argument they would give you that's what this
Got it.
argument. That's why that's what this law is all about, and that's why we need to maintain it.
That we don't want to be too leveraged. The ships operating that we need to transport our goods shouldn't be too leveraged to some foreign interest. That's basically it. Is that a fair way to put it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it. And then obviously they'll also argue that this is good for our economy, that this employs lots of Americans, and
Right.
blah blah blah. You can
Yeah.
fill in the blanks.
Got it. But you can add a little but there. the ships haven't been
Yeah.
built and all this kind
So,
of stuff.
but
Yeah,
my but is I think those are all laudable goals, but I
yeah,
think you have to step back. Is this working? And I think that
yeah.
all of our laws, much not just the Jones Act, but just the general principle, our laws should be subject to a cost benefit analysis. And
Right.
well, a cost benefit analysis, and also are they working? And I think by any reasonable metric, ship production, the number of ships, the number of mariners employed, the benefits we reap versus the costs that are imposed, it fails. And I think you also have to ask yourself, okay, I get the goals. Is there a better way of doing this? And I think the
Mm.
answer is absolutely yes, there are better ways of doing this. So the
Which
goals are reasonable. The method is not.
is very costly, and those better ways. I think some of the policy suggestions you alluded to before, maybe some of those, so those better tweaks. Um, so cool. This has been kind of a big education. Maybe we can sort of round off by, I know there's been, it seems like, and maybe this is just because I've been on your Twitter feed a lot more in the last few days than before, but it seems like there's like renewed interest in American shipbuilding as part of like the push towards reindustrialization. I think that's how I look at it in the US, and both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have both been very keen on sort of building back better, or whatever phrase you want to use. Um, is that true? Like, what's going on? Is there a change in the waters in terms of how people are thinking about the Jones Act and American shipbuilding, and anything like that that you can speak to?
Yeah, I
Or
think
am I
there's at
off?
least two.
Am I off?
There's a lead. No, I think you're definitely on to something. I
Yeah,
think there's a renewed focus on shipbuilding that we haven't seen in quite
yeah.
some time. And I think there's at least two elements to this. One is that there's a strong realization. I think it was last year there was a report that was leaked from a military document that showed that the U.S. military says that China has like 232 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. I think
Mm,
that woke a lot of people up.
mm,
God forbid that our rivalry with China become, an outright hostile, a war, a
mm,
conflict.
mm.
But obviously, should that happen, there would be a strong maritime element to that, just given the geography. And you need ships, and people are waking up to the fact that we don't have a lot. We're not building a lot. The Chinese are. That's a problem. Um, and then I think that also feeds into there was a case, a petition filed by some unions back in March with the U.S. Trade Representative's office that basically said the reason the U.S. shipbuilding industry is in the dire straits it's in is in large part due to unfair practices by China. They're out there, again, as I mentioned earlier, subsidizing their industry. We can't compete, and that explains why U.S.
Mm.
shipbuilding is at where it's at, with obvious, detriment to U.S. national security. So there's definitely a realization that the U.S. is in a bad place, and it's leading to, I think, an interesting conversation because beyond the commercial uh, component that we've been emphasizing in this conversation, there's also a lot of U.S. naval shipbuilding is over budget, not building a rapid enough clip, very delayed. So
Mm.
there's a lot of talk you hear these days about leveraging the capabilities of some of our allies to repair, maintain, possibly even build some ships for the Navy in overseas shipyards. I
Got
think
it.
the former commander of the U.S. Pacific Command testified before Congress just a few weeks ago about, yeah, this is something we really need to consider taking advantage of that. I saw a member of Congress just a week or two ago from Georgia on the House Armed Services Committee said, we should, yes, build our warships here in the United States, but things like sea lift ships for the Navy and auxiliary ships, like why not build those in Korea? They build dozens of them a year, and we build like one or two. What are we doing? So, and I think that this relates to the Jones Act because if we go down that path, it's going to be very strange if we wind up in
Yeah.
a place where the Navy is building its ships in, say, South Korea. Then we say,
Right.
oh, it's a total threat to national security if we let them build a
Right.
tanker in South Korea. That's going
Yeah,
to be
that's
very
fair.
odd
That's yeah.
juxtaposition.
That's probably impossible to defend, if I think about it. But That's okay. That's interesting. Um, Great. If you don't mind, Colin, I just wanted to ask, just taking a slightly different turn here, like a little bit of a almost on the personal front. Like your career fascinates me in a way. It's like you've been sort of really laser focused on this policy issue, and you know our publication is sort of targeted as young, thoughtful, you know, American adults who are sort of interested in you know what's going on in the U.S. Across various different subjects. And if there's somebody out there who may be intrigued by that, like interested in policy, what it takes to really like move the needle in terms of policy. Is there anything you'd like to share in terms of just what it's been like, you know, this kind of work? Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's great because some people, I don't know what people's conceptions are, but they may think or be tempted to think that this situation where I work at Cato and I get my orders from higher up, and they say, "Go, Colin, go write about the Jones Act."
Right.
Basically, I work at the Center for Trade Policy Studies, and my mission is to advocate for free trade. And I focus a lot on the Jones Act because I find it interesting. I think it's fascinating, and I also think it's hugely impactful. There are other things I've written about as well, like the U.S. sugar program,
Mm.
which is a horrible program, which basically, for those unfamiliar, makes U.S. sugar prices far above those, 2 to 3 times higher than the international price, which is why if you buy Coca-Cola, it has high fructose corn syrup in it rather than actual sugar, and why if you
Mm.
want Coke made with cane sugar, you have to go buy Mexican Coke rather than American Coke. Anyway, and I think that's a really bad pro. It just offends me
Oh,
kind of on a moral level, because there's obviously just a small group of sugar farmers reaping the benefits, and all of us consumers, we suffer, and other businesses suffer from it.
I'm
But
making a note of that. That's really interesting. Yeah.
ultimately, it's estimates are costs are a few $1 billion, and that's bad. But I just think the impact of the Jones Act is just so much more profound. I mean, if we got rid of the sugar program, things would be better. I just think, but if we got rid of the Jones Act, my goodness, the changes that we could see, and all the efficiencies that could be brought to bear. Because again, ultimately, this is about transportation. Transportation touches everything, and also just ships are cool. I think it's really fascinating. Well, now why so that goes a long way in explaining why I've laser focused on it. Another reason is because I guess you can try to be a jack of trades, and you can weigh in on this issue this week and the next issue the other week. And like my boss Scott Lincecum, he does that, and he does it really well. I'm impressed with his scholarship. I don't think I'm one of those people. I think that if I spread myself too thin, I wouldn't be an expert on kind of anything. And so I want to focus on this to develop a deeper understanding. And also, I do it because no one else is. I say no one, I might be exaggerating, and I don't want to not give credit to people out there that do talk about this.
Mm.
But my fear is that if certainly if Cato wasn't, there just wouldn't be that much talk about the Jones Act. I think it's deserving of a lot more attention.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel like I'm filling a space that I feel like few people have kind of stepped up. So those are some of the reasons why I've taken this on, and why I keep banging on about it. Even though I do still write about other things, I certainly don't talk about them as much on my Twitter feed. Um, and then as
Yeah.
far as, making an impact, that's hard to evaluate because, I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, Colin, you've been at this for years and the Jones Act is still there, so it's a total failure, right? Um, you
Yeah.
could make that argument,
Yeah.
but, another thing, I think we're trying to do here at Cato is just raise awareness. I think
Yes.
your average American doesn't know about this law, and they
Yeah.
should, because again, I think it's impactful. There was an episode of Jeopardy back in 2019 or so where the category was Puerto Rico's $5 question. The answer was the Jones Act, and none of the contestants knew. And I mean, obviously, these are
Yeah.
smart people.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to think in 2024, if that were to repeat, that one of them would know the Jones Act, because I do, it's all anecdotal, but I do detect a greater awareness of the law and a greater interest in the law. Like the Atlantic last year, my colleague Scott Lincecum, who's also my boss, wrote a piece about the Jones Act for the Atlantic, and that's not because Cato rang up the Atlantic and said, "Hey, this is law you guys should be writing about." No, they reached out to us and said, "Yeah, we think this is interesting. Can you, write something for us?" And there's a New York Times column written last year, the year before, that was devoted to the Jones Act. I just see the amount of interest seems to be picking up.
Yeah.
Maybe it's
Yeah.
also just because maritime is more in the news between the port crisis during COVID to the
Yeah.
Suez, the Ever
Yeah.
Given, and
Yeah.
it just seems maritime keeps popping up,
Yes,
and
that's
the
true.
Jones Act
That's true.
seems to pop up. So I don't know, cause and effect, and how much Cato has to do with any of this, but I'd like to think that at least some of it is due to our effort to try to raise awareness, because I do think it's a big deal
Yeah.
and it is deserving of more attention. And I'm glad to see that you guys taking an interest in this and kind of
Yeah.
doing your part to raise awareness.
No, I mean, I had no business like this wasn't my world, but yet somehow it fell on my radar because of things I was listening to and reading, and then for some reason it clicked for me as well, and then you read a little bit about it and you kind of get a sense of what the implications of it could be. So it's like water dripping on stone, like eventually you start to make a groove. That's if policy changed on like a whim every couple of years, that probably wouldn't be a good thing either. So
No, and
uh,
I'll just add that I think that Congress changed the law. That's the last domino to fall, right?
that's
There's
all.
a lot of
Yeah,
other law steps between that and
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And that's the last thing that will happen in this whole process. So I'd like to think that maybe a couple initial dominoes have been knocked over on the way to that happening.
Awesome. Well, this is great. Thank you. Thank you for taking this time to walk through all the different nuances. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, likewise. I really appreciate the invitation.